That's great.
You like that, Dan?
Yeah, I like that. I think you got a hit there.
I did. I wish it was my hit.
Yeah, right. You're one of the most recorded drummers, if not the most recorded drummer of all time.
Well, it has been said that I am the most recorded drummer in history. Of course, that covers all types of recordings, not just records. Covers film, television shows, and commercials, and phonograph recordings, and everything. I've done quite a bit of them over the years, so, and I've lived long enough for that to stretch out.
Right.
Thank God.
Right. A lot of that was done in L.A. What we want to do is go back and focus on your influence in New Orleans and how you changed the history of R&B. So we're going to cover certain grooves that you played with some of the influential musicians of that period. Now let's go on to some of your recordings with Fats Domino, the part to I'm Walkin'.
Oh, yeah.
Which starts out with the great bass drum figure.
Yeah, the second line parade beat,
Mm-hmm.
and then it went into a continuous snare drum thing.
What I found was really interesting is that that's all left-hand lead. It starts with the left hand, which you're a right-handed drummer.
Yes.
Right? But it's all coming from the left.
It starts, the very first stroke is with the left hand.
So you can play your back
You
beat.
set up the half beat on the third beat.
Well,
those first two beats, the first beat and the second, the first beat with the left hand, the second beat with the right hand is actually the 2/8 notes. The third one is on the second beat. The 2/8 notes of the first beat, and the second beat is the after beat.
Right.
So that's how that's the reason it starts on the first beat. That was all on the snare drum. It started with the parade beat on the bass drum, and then the rest was all on the snare drum. It was kind of interesting. I found it. I was kind of surprised that why did I come up with that? I think Dave threatened me. I had to come up with something.
Something new. Huh?
Something different, without any cymbals.
They didn't want to use cymbals at that time.
Well, we used them, but the idea of just doing it on the snare was a little bit different. I don't know of anything that had been done like that before, with that kind of rhythm in that vein, other than marches perhaps and so forth, but it turned out fine.
Did you march at all when you were younger?
Well, strange as it may seem, when I was young and coming up as a drummer here, I had never played in a second line band.
Really?
I always wanted to, but for some reason or other in those days that was relegated to the older guys. When you're a young musician coming up, if you hadn't had the experience of playing in a parade band, they wouldn't let you do it. There was all of the old fantastic snare drum players, and even further back than that, a guy played the snare drum, they wouldn't let him play the bass drum, and vice versa.
Right.
The bass drums were unique artists, the bass drum players and the snare drum players.
But you heard all these things, and that's definitely a two-player part that you're playing.
Well,
by
yeah,
yourself.
you come up listening to it all your life here, you know, and when you become a drummer and you want to play it, you're only one guy. If you want to play it, you had to play it, you know. And but that's something that people here were born listening to in New Orleans all their lives, man. Whatever little figure you might play on the bass drum, there's always a big accent on fourth. Sometimes you might play a whole two-bar figure, and you're waiting for that accent you missed on the fourth beat of that first bar, so you play a two-bar figure, and it builds all the way up to another big accent on the fourth beat. And that's really the basis of what makes New Orleans drummers different. Even when they don't accent it, they're playing in another idiom of music, let's say. Even when they don't accent it as hard, the pulse of that feel is always there with them. And I personally think that's what really is the difference in New Orleans drummers. You will find, I did it, the older drummers before me that I heard in the parade bands, they were doing that. You find the younger drummers like Smokey and Zigaboo, Johnny Vodakovich and those guys, when they're playing, they're always thinking that four, whether they're playing that type of music or not.
Can you break down Tipitina for us?
Fes's Tipitina.
Right.
Fes's Tipitina was very much, as you may have heard through a number of his things, they had quite a Latin influence to it, almost a strict rumba. So the drum rhythm, on at least the things I played, had a lot to do with playing it as a rumba. But there was a pattern that he always liked himself, that he played a lot on the piano.
Right.
Was that kind of reflected on the old New Orleans Mardi Gras Indian tribes who played those kind of rhythms on the tambourine. But basically on the bass drum, it was more or less a rumba rhythm. It's not a very complicated pattern. Altogether, it swung pretty hard, and it was somewhat unique to it because it was all Fes's way of playing. Even what the drum was playing was largely coincided with what he did on the piano.
The next influential piano player I'd like to talk to you about is Little Richard.
You hardly noticed in Richard's records whether that it was really a quasi mixture of shuffle and straight eights sometimes, because Richard's straight eights was so predominant on his piano, and the rhythm was good enough that you didn't notice that they're playing the dotted 8/16 shuffle field, and he's playing straight eights. And I think the excitement and the intensity of his things kind of overshadowed that, and you never really noticed the difference. For example, on Rip It Up, that was, from the drum standpoint, it was a dotted 8/16 field. But when you put the overall thing together, you hardly notice it was not a straight eighth. And maybe the
Swing.
communion of the two working together was
Absolutely.
somewhat unique.
Absolutely. Could you show us that groove and then break it down a little bit?
Yes, I will. in this particular tune, after the breaks, when I was playing breaks, this is because on the lyrically, Richard was singing breaks, and there was nothing in there but he and I in the breaks. I kept playing right through the breaks, but accenting the breaks with him as though the band was making breaks.
Right.
And then I'd play a fill into the cymbal, and then went back to the snare drum.
Now let's talk about some of the earlier shuffle patterns that didn't have a backbeat in them.
Well, some of the earlier patterns that as far back as I remember, that didn't have a very strong afterbeat or backbeat, if you will, was some of the old Louis Jordan records. It was very, very tight shuffle and not very much afterbeat. Now, the backbeat had been played many times in bands way before we started doing the rhythm and blues, but that was the kind of thing where they played the whole song, and when they got ready to play the out chorus, they had to do something more exciting to finish the piece up. And so to get a little more punctuation in the rhythm, the drummer always went to playing a heavier an accent on 2 and 4,
right,
to denote that they were finishing up, they were going, and even the old Dixieland bands did the same thing, except when they played the afterbeat, they played it even louder on a big crash cymbal that they had over here than they did on the snare drum. When the afterbeat came into prominence, when we began playing early rhythm and blues things, that had a lot to do with the fact that it gave a pulse that people were able to dance to, because they were coming right off of listening to bebop where there was no afterbeat and so forth and those things. So I think that's really one of the things that made a difference in beginning rhythm and blues, which later went on to rock and roll, which you found the backbeats got heavier and heavier and heavier. Well, speaking of the shuffle, the greatest exponent I've ever seen band-wise and drummer-wise playing the shuffle, to play the tightest, cleanest, sharpest shuffle was old Christopher Columbus with Louis Jordan's Timpany 5. Everything they did was basically everything they did was based on the shuffle rhythm, and he played it so wonderfully because he played this. The upbeat was always punctuated lightly on the snare, and both the dotted 8 and the 16th was on the hi-hat, and it was closed hi-hat and tight, and the whole rhythm section played with that feel. They played downbeat very tight so that the 16th note would be more distinctive. And it was just wonderful. He'd rock when he played it. He sat in a oversized bicycle seat that was kind of loose and swiveled, and it made him look like he was in a saddle, and he would rock into that shuffle. He was shuffling without touching the drums all the time. But shuffle rhythm, to me, that wasn't the first time I had heard it, but that's the best I've ever heard it.
Can you give us an example of that tight shuffle?
I'll be happy to.
Another great Little Richard tune is Slippin' and Slidin'.
Oh yeah, that was a wild one. That was pretty wild. That was another example of you not being sure whether it was shuffle or straight eights, as Richard played straight eights. He didn't play so much straight eights to me on that one as he did, because he played a lot of flourishes, you know, that wasn't continuous straight eights while he was singing. He played an awful lot behind the solo and so forth, which wasn't so much straight eights. And there's an awful lot of saxophone solos interspersed between a couple of verses, and then 2 choruses, saxophone, couple of verses, more saxophone, and it faded out with saxophone. Mainly because if you will listen to it, there's no hell of a lot of great lyrics involved in that song. It's just him, excitement, and the saxophone. I'm supposed to have been the drummer that's responsible for playing R&B, but many people have said in California, well, how do you play this, and then you play that, and you play the other? Well, for one thing, before R&B came along, we were all playing jazz.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
You and
everybody
Red
was
Tyler.
playing jazz, right? And the idea of playing rhythm and blues is we had to make it a little more commercial from jazz, because the jazz that we were all trying to play was bebop, and that was very confusing to most people.
Mm-hmm.
So when the record companies came down here, it's because we had that New Orleans feel, and we were able to adjust to make the music a little more commercial and more funky.
You would play some of those same rhythms, but also with the backbeat this time.
With the backbeat and a little less complicated. You know, you would make them simpler and try to make them swing harder and make them happier.
So these jazz-based rhythms that were, as you say, making people happy, making them a little more commercial, and you started playing these things in the studio. And primarily that was with Dave Bartholomew's band.
Yes.
Which was based on Louis Jordan's band.
In a sense, we did a lot of all kinds of music. Some Louis Jordan tunes, some of Dave's own originals, some of what we had recorded with Fats, and the band was a versatile band. It had to be. We were playing different places.
Right. So then that kind of became labeled R&B, even though none of the musicians were really thinking that way.
No,
correct?
no.
Now, when did it start to be called funk?
That came about, from what I understand, as Mac Ravenack says. I think Earl King also mentioned it in an interview where I had tried to make them understand that people were coming down here just to record with this band, and they were just going through the motions and playing as though that's all they came here for. And I said, well, you got to do something with the music, make it a little funkier. And from what I understand, that's the first time that it had been used in that context with respect to music, because it's a word that had always been used around here about something that smelled bad. It was funky.
Funky.
So my definition was to make it smell bad, make it funky and down dirty or something, and not just play the notes.
Another feel that this band was very well known for was the 12/8 type of, or if you want to call it a triplet type feel.
Triplet
that made
type
so
feel.
many hits.
Yeah.
But it was really kind of a moving. You know, it wasn't a laid-back 12/8, but
It was kind of pushing, because it was like adding another beat in the middle of a shuffle, really.
Can you show us what that sounded like at that time?
Yes, of course. As you can see, Dan, that triplet you were talking about was really based on, like I said, adding another beat in the middle of the dotted 8 and 16th. Because it's like a shuffle, and you add another beat you divide it and add another beat and make it a triplet. And then, as I demonstrated before, there was a thing of playing 2 16th notes in between that. That middle triplet beat became 2 16ths. Yeah, and it became da 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 da. That came a little later, mostly in California, though. That did.
Okay.
But prior to that, everybody was playing the triplets around here on those things.
What about some of your other influences? You've talked about drummer Bigfoot Bill Phillips.
Bigfoot Bill Phillips was a terrific drummer, wonderful drummer. As a matter of fact, my first set of drums I got was from Bigfoot Bill Phillips. And that was an influence, but I think the greatest influence on me of drummers here locally was Freddie Coleman. Freddie Coleman was a terrific drummer. It used to be a joke that we said, with Freddie play, you could set your watch by him. His time was so impeccable.
So was he playing jazz styles? I know you...
Freddie played everything. He played jazz. I remember years ago as a kid, he was playing with a wonderful, great big band we had around here, Joe Robichaud's band. This was prior to the Sidney Desvines and Wardell Curzon and different guys like that got a big band together. If you listen to these guys, the guys I mentioned and other guys, there were other guys who had that who were terrific jazz drummers like Edward Blackwell and guys like that, Vernell Fournier. And all of these guys, right? If you notice in Poinciana, Vernell was very famous for playing with Ahmad Jamal.
Right.
He had that big accent on fourth beat in there. And it really made the whole rhythm, the whole song. Poinciana was just a pretty song that everybody had been playing, but that was the difference. That rhythm that he was playing in there is really what made it, man. It was
a New Orleans street beat.
That's right. That's true. I think before you're born, you feel that pulse while you're being carried by your mother. You feel that. And you never find a kid in New Orleans clapping his hands on 1 and 3. It's always on 2 and 4. And whether they know it or not, I think they clap a little bit louder on 4 than they do on 2.